Over the years of doing Not Your Average Globetrotter, I have come up with episodes in sometimes the most odd ways possible. Sometimes I let just inspiration strike whenever it strikes. And about a week ago, more or less, I was just walking in my apartment, I was putting a sweatshirt on, and all of a sudden my glasses fell. And the frames actually happened to shatter. It was a very, very strange thing that I had never, ever experienced before. And I've been wearing glasses ever since I was a kid, so this was a first for me. I'll admit I was kind of ready to get a new pair of glasses anyway, but it's definitely frustrating to have to go and shop for glasses. I also tend to be someone who's a little extra picky when it comes to glasses, and I'm a big guy and big heads, so glasses are not always the easiest for me to find. But this got me thinking about what might be an interesting idea for an episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter, and this week I wanted to talk about some of the frustrating things about living abroad on the other side of the world. Of course, I'm Rafael Di Furia. This is another episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter, and roll that intro. I've been living abroad for quite a few years at this point, but even when I was still living in the States as a kid, there were a number of times that we went abroad, and there was one time in particular that I remember going to Brazil. It was my first time there, first time being engulfed in Brazilian culture. And I have to say it was really quite an odd experience for this one kid who grew up in the US to be in this land full of people who are Brazilian. I mean, if you know Brazilian, you know Brazilian. Loud, warm, welcoming, amazing people. It was a very big difference from some of the things that I was used to growing up. But one of the things that I noticed was that people really were not afraid to jump into deep subjects very quickly, and even with a kid. And in my case, I was the token half Brazilian kid who grew up in the US. So if you know about that, you also know that there's a little extra something that goes on top of being the kid who's Brazilian but not from Brazil. And that brings me into the first topic of this episode, which is being expected, not just in Brazil, but in many places, to be up to date and be willing to be a representative of the country that you are from, at least in a political sense, and knowing all of the details and being ready to bash or praise the current leader. But going back to my experience in Brazil, there was a family friend who we ended up seeing in the town where my family is from, just walking around or in a restaurant or something. I don't remember exactly the scenario where we were, but I just remember this guy coming up to me and he said to me, Clinton, you very good presidente, né? This was already during the Bush era, and Clinton was president when I was quite a bit younger, and I knew he was president, but all the details of the escapades and everything that happened during that time, I wasn't necessarily aware of. But even now, as an adult, I do find that there are many situations where I walk into and even meeting new people or being thrown into social situations or even professional situations, and people are ready to jump in on the deep end of American politics, and that I have to be the representative who is ready to say what's going on, who's doing what, and how everything is going. The next thing I do want to talk about that has gotten better over the years has to do with efficiency. And this is going to depend on what country you're in, and some countries are getting better, some countries are getting worse, some things are just staying status quo. But I can say it's funny to me how things work in the US that I hear about sometimes, and thinking about how life works in Europe, or in a lot of Europe at least, or Southern Europe. For example, a family friend is just about to move into another apartment. And of course, in my mind, as somebody who's living in this part of the world, the thought is, well, it's probably going to be a little while before you can move in and get everything ready. And I mean, will it be a month or will it be a few weeks before you can get in? And this person said that, no, it's just going to be a week from Monday, then that they'll be able to get in. They went to go and see the apartment and sign the contract on the spot, ready to go. The contract was there. Whereas in a lot of Southern Europe, and maybe even different parts of Europe as well, that you will find that contracts for rentals are quasi-negotiable, and that there are certain details that you will want to iron out and figure out who's responsible for what and when and how, and even how much something might be paid. And then even, for example, in some cases, you may even be able to negotiate what the monthly rent will be. I remember one particular experience of renting an apartment was about a month of back and forth before everything was said and done. There are certain things in the US where there is a level of efficiency that may not feel super fast when you're dealing with it there, but you definitely notice it when you're experiencing the exact opposite of efficiency outside of the States, which can lead to some frustration. Signing up to certain services or whatever it might be that's involved with a move. In Southern Europe, it's not uncommon for things to take a little while, or that if you're needing something to be fixed, that the fix-it man will say, oh, I'll be there in a few days, when a few days turns into a few weeks, which then turns into a few months. I'm actually going through this right now. I've been waiting for a repairman to show up since November of last year. He came one time to assess the things that needed to be fixed. And he did take care of a few things, but then he said he would be back in a few days, and now it's March. So here I am, still waiting. But another frustrating thing is, even if you get fluent in another language, even if you are very comfortable in another language, you will never be a native speaker. You can maybe get to the point where your level is pretty close to native speaker level, but there will be certain idioms that just come by that just remind you that it's not your first language, or that there are going to be little phrases or dialectic differences between the normal version of the language that you learned and this new word that you're being exposed to, or new phrase that you're being exposed to. That there are just certain things about being a native speaker of a language that just click and make sense. And it can be frustrating at times when you have that realization that there are those things that you didn't grow up with those cultural frames of reference, that maybe you're not having that same ability of putting two and two together in the same way as somebody who grew up in that language. As I've said in so many episodes, learning a new language and moving to a whole new country can feel like you're learning to walk and talk all over again like a toddler. Like you're just getting to be able to move around on your own. You're just being able to get to the point where you can say things beyond mama, dada, help me, and pick me up. There's a certain aspect of language acquisition that you get when you are raised within a language, that you just have the ability to be comfortable within that. That can be frustrating as a second language speaker, that you don't end up having that same ability as a first language speaker might have. Even if you get to the point where you are speaking fluently, even if you are speaking at a very high level. The next thing, though, on my list is to do with making friendships as a quote unquote expat. I know many people hate that word, but if you don't know why I use the term expat instead of immigrant, I'll try to remember to leave that in a comment section below here on YouTube or in a link on the screen. So if you have a problem with that word, that's on you. In short, I use it because it's faster to say than immigrant or person who's moved to another country or person who has decided to live in another country. Because immigrant also can refer to an immigration process, and not everybody is an immigrant who moves to a new country. Because there are some people who might have the right to be able to remain in a country because of whatever citizenship that they have, especially if you are a dual citizen and you are living in the EU. So even in that regard, immigrant technically isn't correct for a dual citizen. But here I am thinking that I wasn't going to get into that topic, but I got into that topic. But regarding living this expat life, living in this world as a foreigner, going to a new country and making friends, I've had the experience where I've really avoided the expat bubble, and then I've had other times where I've embraced the expat bubble. And I think it's nice to have a balance in between. But one of the issues that I see that happens in a lot of expat communities around the world is that they are very mobile. It's very common for people to be ready to move on to the next location. Their investment emotionally into the place isn't maybe as deep as somebody who's from there. I know, an absolute shocker, completely out of left field. But I've noticed in a lot of expat communities, there are people who come and go, that there are people who go back to their country, there are people who go to another country, there are people who are there only temporarily, then there are the digital nomads that kind of float within the expat communities, even if they're not actually part of the community, but they're just kind of there sometimes, maybe, or they're just there one time. And then all the expats who are actually living there find out that the person's a digital nomad and then get kind of annoyed when they're starting to make these connections with the person and building up emotional bonds and friendships with them when they're just about to kind of blast off and go on to the next location. It's a thing. It happens. Not for everybody, but it can happen. But even in expat circles, there are going to be people who will remain there for the rest of their lives, but in many cases, the friends that you make are going to be your friends for a certain period of time until you're ready for the next place or they're ready for the next place. Does it happen that people will remain in the same place forever? Yes, it's possible, but it can be quite frustrating when you put time and emotions and energy into building a group of friends and becoming part of a community. And then all of a sudden it kind of starts to fade away. People move to one place or another, or the community ends up changing. And then you feel like even though you've remained in the same place for a while, that you're kind of having to start all over, like that you're having to build a new group of friends without having gone to a new place. Like, yeah, if you're moving to a new location, if you're moving to a new country, of course it's a given that you're going to have to make new connections with people. But if you're staying in one place, it's nice to have familiar people around you. And of course, this is one of the reasons why I say learn the language, because once you start making local friends, okay, the local friends are more likely to remain in these locations as well. Although there's a caveat to that, and that could very much depend on the country that you're in and the age bracket that you're in as well, because in some places in the world, young people are going to be very much more likely to want to move abroad for work or opportunities or things that they might see that could hold a better, more positive, bright future in front of them. Another frustrating thing has to do with dealing with time zones, whether that is keeping up with your family and friends back in your home country or dealing with meetings across borders. I mean, even if it's just a 1 hour time difference, sometimes that can be just enough to throw things off and make them a little confusing and thinking, wait, was it 6 o'clock my time or 6 o'clock their time? Or even there are friends that I've lost touch with over the years because when they're available is the middle of the night for me, or when I'm available is early morning for them and they're just heading off to work. Or even for work, when you are trying to plan out a meeting and make sure that multiple time zones are covered, that people in each one of these time zones is available, then yeah, that can get a bit complicated to have to deal with. Even for me, there's an international podcasting online community that I've kind of been a part of for a number of years now that is mainly based in America, or at least the people who are there are based in different time zones in the States. But usually when they have their kind of live broadcasts and online meetups, it ends up being at like 4 o'clock in the morning my time or 3 o'clock in the morning my time. And there have been a few times that I've made it to one of these online meetups broadcasts, but to have to think about, well, if I want to do this, then that means I'm giving up a good chunk of my day the next day. It ends up making it very unrealistic to keep up with on any kind of regular basis. So again, this is one of the things that is really nice about being able to make a life for yourself in the location where you are. And this actually does argue against a point that I've made many, many times on Not Your Average Globetrotter about working remotely from your new country and setting yourself up in that way so you're not reliant on the new country that you're going to be in, and regardless of whatever kind of income level that exists in that place. So for example, maybe you could be working from Central Europe and dealing with people on the west coast of the US. You get all of your work done, and then the clients that you're dealing with maybe get the delivery right first thing in the morning when you finished it, and then they have time to review it, and then you get the things the next day. And so in that case, it actually can work for you, and it can work in your favor to have that time difference if you know how to kind of work with it, and you don't have to be live with the people at the same time. But if you have to be live, co-working together and accessible and available, then this can become very annoying, especially if you're dealing with 12-hour time differences. And I've known people over the years who will work in the evening all the way through the middle of the night because they have to be available during those times to keep up with the office hours from the time zone that they left. And then they end up having only like half of a life in the new place because they're working the whole evening and not really getting to enjoy everything that the place has to offer. Not that the evening, though, is the only time that you can enjoy a place, but if you only get one part of it, then you might not be able to meet up with local friends in your local time zone when most people are going to probably be available if you want to meet up for coffee, drinks, or whatever it might be. But yes, I am generalizing. And of course, there could be situations where things could work out really nicely for the right person in the right situation. But time zones in general, very frustrating to have to deal with. The final thing on my list is coming across the preconceptions that many people have, that the prejudices that you find between different groups. There are positives and negatives that come up. And I mean, if you're specifically talking about Americans, there are many preconceptions that people have about the quote unquote wealthy American who moves to this new country and is coming with money bags and is able to just, for lack of a better term, just make it rain everywhere and spend left and right without really having to think about it. And there are times that this has come up even in my own life where people have this idea about me, and I'm just a guy working like everybody else and living on a very similar income to what people locally might be earning, depending on when and where in my life and what country. But even in dating, for example, for me as a single guy, this has been something that unfortunately I've had to deal with, that there ends up being this idea, oh, he's this wealthy American guy who's doing X, Y, and Z in his life, and he's got a YouTube channel. He's a YouTuber. So of course, if he's a YouTuber, he's making money. I think there are some Americans, though, who do kind of play into it a little bit, or people who are from countries that could be perceived as wealthy individuals that are coming and taking over and blah, blah, blah. And I've seen many expats who reside in a place and just treat the locals horribly and just don't give them the respect that they deserve. I mean, I'm very much the type of person that believes that you should treat a person with the same respect that they give to you. Maybe a little bit more. I mean, for example, if someone is greeting you and has a smile on their face when you're walking into a store, it's not the worst thing to be able to be friendly back to them. If you're walking down the street and it's commonplace in that culture to say hello, good morning to the person passing by you, then yes, it is not a horrible thing to say hello, good morning with a smile on your face. Although one thing for Americans to keep in mind, smiling in some cultures, just randomly on the street to somebody you don't know, can be seen as like a little odd to do. I mean, even like if you're in Eastern Europe, for example, people might think you're not working with a full deck of cards or that there are a few screws loose or something. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But then also there's another factor that you don't just simply say, hi, how are you, to everybody that you meet walking down the street. This is actually something that some scammers prey upon, especially in Europe. When you're in tourist destinations, you'll have an individual come and say, hi, how are you? Where are you from? Oh, you're from Texas. Oh, you're from here. Oh, you're from there. Expecting the response that a lot of American tourists have, that they will get into a conversation with the person because they're being friendly. Just know if a random person comes up to you, striking up a conversation like that, and maybe they're holding some necklaces or they're trying to sell some balloons or whatever, they're going to try to get money from you. Even if they say, oh, no, don't give me money. This is just a gift from me to you. Then they say, oh, no, but my family, you could help my family maybe. And so that's just one thing to keep in mind, that is a very common hustle that you find across European tourist destinations. And then also the other thing for Americans to note is that it is not common in many languages that you ask a person, hi, how are you? Whereas, like, for example, in the US, when you're walking into a place, you ask, hi, how are you? And it's just the equivalent of hello, good morning, hello, greetings, I am acknowledging your existence. But do people actually care what the answer is? No, because the answer is always good, fine, thanks, how are you? Because nobody actually cares when they ask how you doing or what's up. So if you are in a place like Europe, for example, and you talk to somebody that you don't know and you ask them, hi, how are you doing? Be prepared for a real answer. Or if they're not going to tell you everything, you might get a very strange look and some kind of reaction like, wait, you don't know me like that. It's actually almost like a very intimate kind of question in some cultures, or a question that you really only ask people who you know, that you interact with on a regular basis, or just friends. The level of which will depend on the culture, the country, and the interpersonal dynamics that you happen to have between you and the other person that you're talking to at the time. But getting back to this frustration, these preconceptions that people have, these prejudices, it's really unfortunate sometimes, or maybe assuming that somebody is a certain type of way because they're from a certain country. For example, I don't often talk about my background, about being Brazilian, being half Brazilian, especially in certain parts of Europe, because there is a preconception, because there is a reputation of sorts that many Brazilians have of being a certain type of way, or maybe that in Portugal, for example, a lot of Portuguese people say, oh, they don't do this, or they bring crime to the country, or they do that, or whatever it might be. I don't necessarily agree. I find Brazilians to be some of the hardest working people I've ever met. Not all Brazilians, but I've known many hardworking Brazilians who are willing to do whatever they can for their families. Or even in Italy, for example, I wouldn't necessarily mention the origin of my family background because there might be a certain feeling towards people from that part of the country. Because if your family doesn't come from X, Y, or Z area, or if your family does come from X, Y, or Z area, oh, that must mean you're a certain type of way, or that must mean because you have this connection that you're a certain type of way, or your family is a certain type of way, you come from a certain type of people that people might have prejudice towards. If only it were possible to live in a world where everything is ideal and we could all just respect each other equally in the moment based on the respect that we're given. Anyway, I'm Rafael Di Furia. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter. Again, thank you to those of you who helped to make these episodes possible on a monthly basis through RafaelDiFuria.com/Patreon, Patreon.com/RafaelDiFuria, as well as a thanks button here on YouTube. They all very much help this project to be able to continue, as well as if you have any ideas or any thoughts or anything to say on the topics spoken about today, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. Always interested to hear what you guys have to say, whether you agree with me or disagree with me, or bring up a new point that maybe I didn't even think about. But anyway, again, I'm Rafael Di Furia. Stay safe and healthy out there, and I will see you all next time for another episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter. Later.